Welcome to another edition of
Ask Alex.
We're here live with Alex Amani, who's going to talk to you today on the topic of
ARVs.
ARVs versus fair market price. How do I determine what's fair for my property?
So, the one thing about ARVs, what it stands for is after repair value. It can go all over the map because single family housing, if it's based on suburban subdivisions, it's much easier to calculate an ARV because those houses were built in cookie cutter models, 50 to 100, row houses. You can always go in and look on the multiple listing service or through a realtor and see what was sold in that neighborhood, how many bedrooms, bathrooms, square footage, and what type of finish out they had. Easier to calculate ARV. And even with today's technology, those are pretty much spot on. The biggest issue you have with ARVs calculating is the houses that are actually within the cities, right? The ones that have been built in the 1920s, 1930s. Some areas have gotten gentrified. Some areas are, you'll have ARV of a house of $500,000, and right next door you have an ARV of a house of $50,000. Well, why is that? Well, this house was totally torn down, rebuilt, but if you're looking at it just on the screen, it makes no sense. So ARV is easier to calculate more towards suburban houses and a little bit more difficult to calculate in the cities itself.
Okay. So how much do you think the area of town impacts the ARV, or is it the style of home?
The area of town definitely impacts, right? That's how you determine the value of the house. So back to earlier, the same question is suburban versus cookie cutter versus inner city houses, right? So they can vary either way. I think what impacts the ARV more than anything, what people don't realize, is the finish out, right? So you may have an individual that says, hey, you know what, my house is worth $300,000. Okay, well, Mr. Smith, how did you come up with $300,000? Oh, my neighbor sold his house for $300,000. Okay, let's look at some pictures of your neighbor's house. Now, if you look at your neighbor's house, he just spent $30,000, $40,000 upgrading it to bring it to today's standards. So yes, his house is worth $300,000. But if you haven't spent the money, on paper, yeah, if you want to compare the same square footage, same bedrooms, same bathrooms, same style house, maybe the next street over, on paper it looks like the same amount. But if your finish out isn't equivalent to everyone else's finish out, then your ARV can't. Your ARV will be what it is, what needs to be if you create that finish out. But if you don't, your after repair value will not match what you're thinking you're going to get, because you have to match apples to apples.
So how do you approach a homeowner and you know that the ARV says one thing, but they want to tell you about this wonderful mansion next door to their shack from 1978. How do you explain that to a homeowner?
That happens every day and twice on Sunday. Okay? Because to every homeowner, their home is in immaculate condition, right? They have done every repair you could ever imagine to it. Everything is upgraded as much as possible because they don't know any better, right? To them, that's where they live. It's their home. It's their sanctuary. And the last thing you want to tell a homeowner is, well, Mr. Smith, your home really isn't worth what you think it's worth. Because they can take offense to that. This is where their children grew up, where their families are. So you have to show them the data, right? You got to say, look, this is your neighborhood, this is your subdivision, this is your area. This is your square footage, these are your bedrooms, bathrooms, this is what your houses are selling for in your area, and here's some pictures of the houses of the interior that's sold. If your house is equivalent to this, definitely it will sell for what you think it's worth. It's simple as that. No other way to sugarcoat it. But if you just tell them up front, yeah, your neighbor's house sold for X, but we can't sell, your house isn't worth that, they will take offense. But if you show them, they're reasonable people too, then they will come down and say, yeah, you're right, I haven't upgraded my countertops in 20 years, so I'm not expecting to get the same amount as my neighbor just got, because he upgraded his countertops or appliances or the new flooring and paint and stuff like that.
So talk about fair market. How do you explain that to a first-time investor? What is fair market value?
So instead of saying fair market value, let's change that question as is value. That's in our industry what we use as terminology, right? So as is you walk into that property and you look around and you say, what's it gonna take financially, and what kind of upgrades do I need to do, what kind of repairs do I need to do to get it to the ARV of what everyone else's house in the neighborhood is selling for, right? Now, based on what that cost is, you subtract that from what the ARV would be, minus your time and what you want to make, and that's the fair market value, or as is value, right? Because you walked into that house, Mr. and Mrs. Smith haven't touched it in 20, 30 years, so naturally the ARV is not what the market is dictating, it's an as is value. So Mrs. Smith, if we came in here and we upgraded this house, this is what we would spend. Subtract that from the ARV, and that's what your as is value is today.
Gotcha. So you talked about some calculations, and we found some software out there, the Rehab Valuator, the ARValizer, the ReKit. Are there any particular software programs that you found helpful or that are useful?
So there's two types of, I think the question you're getting at is a twofold question. The first is the ARV question, right? Is there a software you can just plug in an address, pumps out an ARV, and says this is what the house is worth, right? That's what everybody wants. That's like the dream, okay? And I've been in this business for almost 20 years. Okay? When I first started, there was no Zillow, there was no software that can calculate ARV. But today's technology, and I go back to my earlier statements of, if your house is a cookie cutter house in a suburban area where these big developers have built thousands of these, those softwares, or Zillow, or even Redfin, or any of these, and I don't want to pick or advertise the software, they're going to come close, because it's what we call artificial intelligence learning, AI. That AI in the last 5 years has improved so significantly, right, that you can even now do a drive-by appraisal, right, or a desktop appraisal as they call it now, right, and now you have to go physically to the house and kind of get a value. But again, those are based on the cookie cutter houses, right? You won't be able to do a desktop appraisal really into one of those houses within the city that, like you mentioned, a mansion and then not a mansion next door. Right? So that's formulas for the ARV. Second part of your question was, okay, the rehab estimator, right? So rehab estimator, there's thousands of these softwares out there. The problem isn't the software, they're all going to do the same thing, right? You're just going to plug in your square footage of the house, your HVAC, blah, blah, blah. The biggest thing you want to know is, if I go into a house with a rehab budget, and you go into a house with a rehab budget, and person number 3 goes in there, I promise you all 3 will come up with a different number. Well, why is that? Well, it all depends on what your construction costs and how dialed in you are. Because that's your one variable, is the rehab, right? So if I go in there and I'm going to do an ARV of a property, and say I make it just like every other house that's sold in the last 6 months, I can pretty much calculate that ARV, no issues, right? The rehab estimate is the one that's the difference between all of us. That's your one variable. So instead of worrying about the software, I think we should worry about, are we dialed into our construction? Right? Because if our per square foot construction cost, or our construction cost comes down, and we're dialed in, you'll make a profit. If the construction cost is not dialed in, you're not going to make a profit because you estimated to spend, and I'm just making this hypothetically, $40,000, and because you're not dialed in, you spend $60,000. Well, where did that $20,000 come out of? It came out of your profit. That's where it came out of. So that's the part that you need to be dialed in on. The most important thing in this business is the construction.
Okay. We do have a question online. The question is, what is option?
Option money?
Yeah, that's what the question is.
Okay. All right.
So it's off topic, but
Yeah,
it's
all-
Ask
okay.
Alex.
Yeah, no, it's not. That's a question. But so option money, right? Or option is when you sign a contract and you say you have a 7-day option, you put in the contract, right? You say that, Mrs. Smith, I'm gonna give you X amount of dollars. Usually it's a small amount, $50, $100, and I'm gonna put your property under contract for 7 days option. That means in those 7 days, I get to do my due diligence. I get to decide if I really want to buy it or not. And if I decide at the end of that option period, I want to terminate because I don't want to buy it for whatever reason, I send a termination, and that money I gave you is yours to keep, but then we're done. I'm not obligated to move further on. That's what they mean by option. So it's like you're paying a little bit of money to tie up their property so you can do their due diligence, your due diligence, to figure out if you want to buy it or not. That's what option is. But yeah, that's way off topic. Okay.
Right.
But hey, ask away.
So we talked a little bit about software and determining ARVs, and you talked about artificial intelligence. How much of this ARV determination is purely based on the software, the science of it, the AI, or just gut knowledge about what you know about the market? And where do the two meet?
So real estate is always local. As much as we and Wall Street and everyone's trying to make it national, it's still local, folks. I mean, no one knows your neighborhood like your local realtor, your local seller, things of that nature, right? So a lot of it, when you calculate ARV, I'll give you one nugget here, right? The properties that are for sale, delete them, right? Because they haven't sold. They're for sale, right? So whatever that person's asking doesn't mean they're going to get that price, right? So let's put that aside. What's sold is what matters, because that's reality. Someone came in and paid X amount of dollars for this property for that price, right? So that's what matters. So when you're calculating ARV, that's what you're going to take your sold comps, right? And then your gut, as you ask, that is when you go inside the house, right? When you're actually looking at the property, right? So, not to take off topic, but let's just give you an example, right? House A, 1,300 square feet, 3 bedrooms, 2 baths, suburban area, great school district. Let's say it's selling for $150 a square foot. House B right next door, same concept, selling for $150 a square foot, right? You go to look at both of them. Except the second house has a terrible floor plan, right? Terrible floor plan, right? You're going to have a much more difficult time selling it. So that is when you look at, I guess you would call it gut, but that's when you actually walk into the house and you can decide from that point on which house makes sense to sell at the price you want to sell it. Because on paper, both just look fine. Numbers look all the same. But when you walk in, I guess that's when you refer to your gut knowledge, right? Like, hey, this house, not rehab knowledge. Rehab is what it is.
Right.
Right? This is floor plan. This is area. This is things like that. That's what you mean by gut, right? Okay.
Absolutely. Okay, we probably have time for one more question, and then we're going to wrap this edition of Ask Alex. It was a great question, and it's right with what you were just talking about. This is from Facebook. It says, what dollar amount should we calculate for a renovation budget in DFW?
$1 million question.
Ding, ding, ding. She wins.
What dollar amount should you calculate for renovation budget, right? It depends on what you're doing to the property. Right? Again, it's one of those where if you are doing a high-end flip, let's say your flip is $600,000, $700,000, $800,000, your dollar amount is much different. You can't put in vinyl planks in that house because nobody's going to buy that. Your buyer is a much higher end buyer, right? So your dollar amount is much higher. If you're, and this has changed from when long time ago to now, where the market is so hot, that houses under $200,000, $250,000, you don't have to do much. Because there's a lack of inventory. There's more buyers than there are sellers, right? So when you go into that house, as long as your majors are good, your 5-point majors, you don't have to spend a lot of money on the cosmetics because, unfortunately, there's not much inventory out there. So it all depends on the type of asset class that you're buying.
Sounds good. Well, we're at a minute. Any closing thoughts that you want to give to the new investor who might be tuning in to Ask Alex to just figure out how do they do this thing called ARV?
So I think the best thing you should do if you want to calculate ARV, get a good realtor. Right? Don't worry about the softwares. Don't worry about, We have a wholesale division too, right? We put ARVs on our properties, and our competitors put their ARVs on their properties. But if you're not doing your own due diligence, you know, that's on you, right? You got to get out there. If you really want to truly enter this space and be an investor, if you're a new investor, right, you have two things. One is you got to be able to pull the trigger, right? Because you don't want to be on the sidelines, right? If you want to go in, you got to jump in the pool. You just got to do it, right? Okay. Second is on the ARVs. Back to your question, get a good realtor on board. Get a couple on board. You know, I mean, you don't have to. You can pay them, you know, like a little bit per comp that they do, and then you know at least you're doing your due diligence at a time, and you got someone that's in the field who understands the house, understands the area, can give you good feedback. Now the realtor has been around, who just graduated, has been a realtor for a year. I mean, their knowledge and experience isn't as good as you want. Get someone who's been seasoned. You know, get them on board with you. That's the best way because they know their market.
Well, we want to thank you for tuning in to our edition of Ask Alex. Tune in next week when we'll have another topic that'll be helpful for you as an investor, for you as a seller, for you as just an interested person trying to learn a little bit from none other than Alex Hamani.